The courthouse steps were packed with people rushing in for the day's biggest hearing. But just as the judge arrived, something no one expected happened. A police K-9 suddenly lunged forward, blocking his path, barking so fiercely that the entire street froze in shock. The handler pulled at the leash, but the dog refused to budge. Then his focus shifted, not just to the judge's briefcase, but to the judge himself. Everyone stared, whispering in fear. Why was this dog stopping a judge? And what came next shook the entire street. Here's the full story, but before we jump in, drop your favorite dog's name in the comments, and make sure you hit that subscribe button. The courthouse steps were buzzing with morning energy. Lawyers hurried past with thick files pressed against their chests, clerks shuffled papers, and the hum of the crowd outside lingered like background noise. It was a day when justice felt alive in the air. Yet all of that was about to collapse into a moment no one on that street could forget. The judge arrived like clockwork. A man of reputation, stern but respected, he had walked those courthouse steps for decades. He wore his usual black robe carried under his arm before hearings began, and his head was bowed with focus. Everything about his routine was precise, predictable, unquestionable. But on this morning, nothing about the scene was ordinary. From the side of the steps, a trained K-9 part of the courthouse security detail stood stiff and alert. His handler held the leash firmly, expecting just another calm start to the day. The dog's eyes were steady, trained to scan movements, sniff out what the human eye could never detect. As the judge neared, the K-9 froze, his ears pinned back, his muscles coiled, and his nose twitched with intensity. The handler gave a light tug, expecting the dog to follow his lead, but instead the K-9 barked, a sharp, startling sound that cut through the chatter of the street. Every head turned. The judge stopped in his tracks, confusion spreading across his face. He took a step forward, and the dog lunged, not to attack, but to block his path. The leash stretched tight, claws scraping against the courthouse steps, growls rising low from the animal's chest. The handler shouted commands, but the K-9 refused to obey. His eyes locked on the judge as though warning of something unseen. The crowd's murmurs swelled into panic. Why would a courthouse K-9, a dog trained to detect explosives, narcotics, even weapons, suddenly halt a judge in plain sight of the entire street? The judge lifted his hands slightly, signaling he was no threat. But the dog only pressed harder, barking with urgency, circling him as if guarding him from something or exposing him. What exactly had triggered the K-9? The handler's face went pale as he struggled to calm the animal. But the K-9 was relentless. He darted around the judge, sniffing at his robes, barking louder, and then froze at his briefcase. The leather bag sat on the step beside him, ordinary at a glance, yet the dog's entire body tensed toward it. Was there something inside? The courthouse guards rushed forward, but the K-9 snapped at them too, forcing them to back away. His behavior was not one of aggression against the crowd, it was a warning, precise and urgent. The judge's briefcase was lifted by one of the officers, and the K-9's barks grew louder still. The handler's commands faded into the noise. The entire street fell silent, every eye on the simple bag that seemed to hold a secret far greater than anyone had expected. Whispers spread fast. Was it explosives? A hidden weapon? Something slipped into the bag without the judge's knowledge? The judge's face tightened. He denied knowing anything, but his words were drowned by the roar of the dog. The officers placed the case onto the courthouse steps. With trembling hands, they began to check it. Slowly, cautiously, afraid of what might lie inside. The dog backed away, his eyes never leaving the bag, his growl rumbling deep. The crowd leaned forward, hearts pounding, but inside there was nothing. Only files, papers, and a gavel. The contents looked ordinary, yet the K-9 had not been mistaken. He paced furiously, sniffing the air, barking now not just at the briefcase but at the judge himself. Why him? Why now, after years of routine? The officers exchanged tense looks. Some suspected a medical issue. K-9s could detect illnesses before humans ever knew. Others wondered if the dog smelled traces of something dangerous, maybe something transferred onto the judge's clothes without his awareness. Still, the suspicion lingered heavier than the air itself. The courthouse staff hesitated to let the judge pass. The handler tried once more to redirect the dog, but the canine planted himself firmly between the judge and the courthouse doors. No amount of pulling or commanding could break him. Something about the judge himself had triggered this reaction. The crowd's curiosity shifted into unease. The street grew quiet except for the sharp barks echoing against the marble courthouse walls. What was the dog trying to say? What could possibly make him defy all training, all obedience, just to stop this man? The judge's eyes darted toward the crowd, then back to the officers. For the first time, his usual calm demeanor cracked. His hand tightened on the handle of his briefcase, and in that small, unguarded movement, suspicion deepened. One officer whispered that the dog might have picked up a scent from the judge's robes, something transferred perhaps from where he had been before arriving here. Another suggested the judge had come into contact with contraband. Theories spun quickly, but none gave a clear answer. The canine's insistence grew more violent. His body was trembling with intensity, his barking echoing through the street like an alarm no one could silence. Finally, the courthouse chief of security stepped forward. His face was grim as he ordered the judge to be escorted back from the steps for questioning. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A judge stopped by his own courthouse security. It was unheard of. The canine settled slightly, still pacing, still watchful. His behavior had forced something into the open, something hidden, now impossible to ignore. The judge raised his voice, protesting his innocence, insisting it was absurd. But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed unease. The officers remained firm. The crowd sensed something larger was unfolding, though none could yet grasp it. What had the dog truly found? What connection tied the judge to the unseen threat that morning? And why did it feel as though the canine had just peeled back the first layer of something far darker than a courthouse routine? As the officers escorted the judge away from the steps, the canine barked once more, sharp and final, as though confirming to the entire street that the mystery was only just beginning. The courthouse doors remained closed. The street stood frozen in silence, and for everyone who had witnessed it, one question hung heavy in the air. What secret had the canine uncovered that even the judge himself seemed desperate to keep hidden? The judge had been escorted away, but the tension refused to leave the street. The courthouse, normally a place where people came seeking clarity, now felt cloaked in suspicion. Every pair of eyes followed the canine, whose rigid stance told the crowd that whatever he had sensed was not yet resolved. The security team pulled the judge aside into a private chamber, the canine and his handler close behind. The dog did not relent, his nose pressed toward the judge's robe, the briefcase, even the cuffs of his sleeves. Growls punctuated the silence, and no command could still him. The officers began their investigation. The briefcase had been checked once already, but this time they examined it more closely. They ran scanners, tested for residues, and inspected each pocket. That was when something unusual emerged. Traces of a powder-like substance clinging faintly to the leather seams. The discovery shifted the entire tone of the room. The substance was swiftly tested, and within minutes confirmation arrived. It was residue of an illicit drug, the type often smuggled in high-stakes cases. But how had it landed on the judge's briefcase? And why had the canine reacted so violently if the traces were so faint? The pieces began to connect. That very morning, the courthouse was scheduled to hear a massive case involving a notorious trafficking ring. Dozens of lives and years of investigation hung in the balance. The judge presiding over it was none other than the man now standing frozen in that chamber. Had someone planted evidence on him? Was this an attempt to discredit or intimidate him before the trial began? The possibility was chilling. The chief of security pressed further. Where had the judge been before arriving at the courthouse? Whom had he encountered? The judge, his voice heavy with a mix of anger and fear, admitted he had stopped briefly near a parking lot before heading in. A stranger had brushed against him there, pretending to ask for directions. At the time, he had thought nothing of it, but now the truth was clear. The traffickers had attempted to compromise him. By planting traces of drugs onto his belongings, they aimed to create suspicion, chaos, and ultimately force his removal from the case. If the plan succeeded, the trial could collapse, giving their criminal network a chance to slip free. And the only reason it had been stopped was the K-9's unrelenting sense of detection. The room fell into heavy silence as the realization settled in. The K-9 had not simply barked at a random suspicion. He had exposed a targeted attack designed to unravel justice at its core. Without him, the trial may have been derailed before it even began. But the story did not end there. When the judge was cleared of wrongdoing, his record and dignity preserved, his expression softened for the first time that day. His stern features carried gratitude, the weight of knowing that his reputation, his case, and the countless lives tied to that trial had been protected not by men in suits or officers with badges, but by a dog who refused to let him pass those courthouse doors. News spread across the street as word of the findings leaked out. The crowd that had waited anxiously outside erupted with relief. They had not witnessed a scandal. They had witnessed a crime foiled in real time. The K-9 emerged from the courthouse steps with his handler, still watchful but calmer now that his work was done. The crowd clapped instinctively, strangers united in awe of a dog who had stopped what human eyes could not see. The judge, now standing at the courthouse steps once more, turned toward the K-9. His robe swayed in the wind. His briefcase now returned to him, cleansed of suspicion. And though judges were rarely men of public display, he lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect to the animal that had saved more than just a case. It had saved his name, his honor, and the very weight of justice in the city. The trial proceeded that same day, uninterrupted. Evidence was presented, criminals were held accountable, and the verdict was delivered with a sense of strength, unshaken by the attempt to sabotage it. Justice had been protected. But for those who had been there, the true verdict had already been delivered on the courthouse steps by the unwavering bark of a K-9 who trusted his senses more than any man. Weeks later, a ceremony was held. Officers, citizens, and courthouse officials gathered together, the memory of that day still fresh. On a small podium, the K-9 stood proudly beside his handler, the judge seated in the front row. When the time came, the chief of security stepped forward holding a medal. His voice carried over the hushed audience as he described the events of that morning, how chaos had been averted, how justice had been safeguarded, and how one K-9's loyalty had preserved the integrity of the court. The medal was fastened to the K-9's harness, gleaming under the lights. Applause thundered across the hall, echoing like the bark that had once silenced an entire street. The judge himself rose to speak, his words measured but heavy with meaning. He spoke of justice, of duty, but most of all, of the unspoken guardians who walked among them, silent until their moment came. His voice cracked slightly when he thanked the K-9, not as a tool of law, but as a hero who had reminded them all that even in the shadow of corruption, vigilance and loyalty could not be silenced. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping until the sound filled every corner of the hall. The K-9 sat tall, chest out, eyes bright, not aware of medals or ceremonies, but content with the recognition of his pack, his people. That day, the street outside the courthouse became more than a memory of panic. It became the story of how one dog, in a single moment of defiance, had rewritten the ending. And as the metal glistened on his harness, there was no doubt left in anyone's mind justice had a protector, and his bark would never be ignored again. And just think, if one dog's bark could change the fate of an entire courthouse, imagine the stories you'll miss if you don't stick around. One click right now keeps you in the loop. Hit like, hit subscribe, and be part of every moment before it's gone.